Okay, Yorana and bonjour. I'll be going through some results from my MA thesis in 2020. And I was basically looking to use zooarchaeology and contextual taphonomy to look at ritual behaviour. So while Polynesian zooarchaeology continues to provide us with these really rich insights on subsistence, for example, the zooarchaeology of ritual practices has remained somewhat overlooked. So I'll be very briefly going through some of my results because there was quite a lot of them, and then some interpretations and future directions from the project. So the project was part of a multidisciplinary project run by CIRAP, combining ethnohistorical and archaeological investigation on Fakahina in the Tuamotus. So I was looking at sea turtle remains across 3 sites to look at the role of the species, as well as in general to develop some zooarchaeological methods for identifying sequences of ritual action in Polynesian contexts. So I hope to answer questions like whether fauna at Fakahina marae could be ritually differentiated and linked with intentional behaviours, whether spatial associations between faunal remains and architectural features could tell us how ritual activities were organised through space, and if these spatial associations between fauna and site features could also clarify their functions or the functions of overall sites. So the sites I'll be discussing today were excavated by my supervisor, Guillermo, in 2018 and 19, and they included MUR9 or Marae Apataki, REV02 or Marae Tarangi Te Tanoa, as well as HAP01B. The preservation between these sites varied quite a lot. So, for example, while MUR9 was relatively well preserved, REV02 was quite poorly preserved, and HAP01B was also very disturbed and had somewhat of an unclear function, but it was identified as the Aru of a marae. So considering this was the first study of its kind in Polynesia, the methods were I guess, somewhat exploratory and tailored mainly to identify intentionality because it's sort of the biggest risk looking at these situations. So my final database categorized fragments by spatial coordinates for spatial analysis, so site, feature, stratigraphic layer, and excavation grid square. And then each fragment was also assessed against your traditional zooarchaeological criteria and criteria that's useful for contextual taphonomy, so weathering, carnivore modification, colour. I mostly used existing criteria like Berensmeyer's weathering, but I did adapt some of these to reflect the variation that we were seeing at the sites. Identification to element for the turtle was actually quite successful, thanks to some good juvenile and adult reference skeletons. But one limitation was identification of turtle to species level, just because the completeness and combinations of turtle elements you need to do this are quite hard to come by archaeologically. An interesting part of this study that was also quite exploratory was the aging of turtle remains. So obviously turtles lack teeth and epiphyses that we use in mammals to provide age estimates. So I essentially had to create and adapt aging criteria that was visible on turtle remains. So this included looking at states of ossification, where hyaline cartilage in turtle is replaced by mineralized bone as the turtle ages. And in terms of creating broad categories of aging, it worked quite well. So for analysis, fauna was separated into sub-assemblages by sites and features, which allowed for their comparison. I created recovery rates and MAU percentages to sort of look more closely at this idea of intentionality and like whether things were being, intentionally differentiated, or if it was more likely the result of a random or naturally taphonomic occurring assemblage. I also used NISP abundances to look at skeletal frequency for broader body parts like limb or skull. And I presented all of my results visually in these illustrated graphics to sort of help with interpretation and comparison, especially the later bringing in of ethnographic accounts. So REV2, the first site I'll go through, had the biggest assemblage of any site, and it actually became a really good case study for contextual taphonomy. So subassemblages from each ritual features in the marae were actually quite helpful in refining their nature and function. So the first I'll go through RUF. Fauna from this feature came exclusively from TP2, which in itself helped to, I guess, confirm the suspicion that TP3 and 1 were interspace and filling between RUF and RUG. In TP2, cranial bones were the most frequently occurring and also the best preserved body parts. And this contrasted with really low rates of preservation for phalanges and vertebrae, which supports intentional deposition because in a complete skeleton, these dense elements are what you're most likely to find the most of. There was also very consistently mild weathering, consistent colour, and a complete absence of carnivore modification. And this could maybe reflect deposition into a closed environment, like a compartment or cyst. It can't be said for certain whether the contents of the cyst represent one or two separate deposition events, but there was a slight increase in weathering and a unique skeletal representation pattern in the lowest stratigraphic layer. So maybe this could suggest that it was an earlier deposit on top of which the rest were then placed. Structure A was interpreted as an intentional deposition of mainly limb bones that made up about half of the feature's NISP. Vertebrae made up almost a quarter, followed by carapace and skull fragments. This feature only had a MNI of 1, so I used MAU instead of recovery rates to look at preservation, but the results were highly compatible with the NISP abundances. So this structure had a much higher and more diverse weathering than RUF. Obviously, we can't say heaps about this, but maybe tentatively it could be a more gradually accumulated deposit and a slightly more open one. So in cyst B, you can see limb bones heavily dominated the assemblage at about 82% of the NISP. And they also had very high preservation rates. So this makes a really strong case for intentional sorting and deposition. Skull bones made up 7% of the assemblage, and these were exclusively orbitine and palatine bone fragments. And these cranial bones had high recovery rates that matched the better preserved limb bones as well. So there were also taphonomic patterns that pointed to the role of this feature as an enclosed cyst. Weathering, again, across the entire stratigraphy was really low, and colour was very consistent. And again, we had a total lack of carnivore modification. So in cyst D, the sample was too small to really do much with quantitatively. But for cyst C, we could look at skeletal frequencies. And it was heavily dominated by plasteron, which made up 86% of the NISP. And the remaining fragments were exclusively limb bones. The fragments in cyst C were also consistently dark and had no carnivore modification, which again suggested a closed cyst or chamber environment. In cyst D, even though it wasn't great for counting, it was still useful taphonomically. We saw moderate to high weathering and consistently very light colour patterns. So this could potentially infer that the contents of the feature were maybe heavily disturbed, or maybe the assemblage represents a more sort of open, gradually accumulated, or even later placed deposit. We can't say heaps about it, but it's still interesting. So cyst M contained the most faunal material out of any feature and was really interesting. I analysed it as an overall assemblage as well as by creating two subassemblages, TP1 and TP2. So TP1 had very diverse weathering ranging from mild to extreme. Overall, taphonomically, it suggested probably one major deposition event into a partially closed environment. We had complete or near complete turtle remains, which seemed like they were placed along other material and then covered with coral gravel, which was found in the excavations as well. Interestingly, numerous complete or near complete rat skeletons supported this idea. We often assume that finding rat skeletons is an indicator of successful burrowing, but actually in this case, it was more likely failed burrowing where they crawled a little too far into some dense substrate and couldn't get out. In TP2, we had certain skeletal parts that seemed very intentionally differentiated. Layer A1 had almost exclusively skull and flipper bones, and B1 was almost entirely carapace and plastron. Another really interesting finding here, even though they couldn't be used quantitatively because the assemblage was pre-sorted, was the finding of dog and bird remains in cyst M. So dog in TP2 potentially clarifies debate about the existence of the species on the atoll, and also the presence of multiple species deposited at a single marae adds substantial diversity to what has previously been recorded or expected. So at REV, comparison of site features was promising for these methods' ability to detect intentional behaviours. We start to get a clearer picture of what parts of turtles are being deposited where, and even in some cases whether they were deposited into an open and closed environment. So this is valuable to consider alongside ethnographic literature. For example, we could maybe start to compare high concentrations of cranial bones at RUF with described ceremonial uses of turtle heads. So quickly, the other two sites, MUR9, it had too small of a sample to do much with frequencies, but it was still interesting. All of the turtle remains that were here were spatially associated with the Ahu and were very well preserved. So it's impossible to say for certain, but there was a turtle bone at the bottom of the construction trench that could have been an act of sanctification during building. There's not a lot of evidence that turtle feasting occurred here, but there are small amounts of turtle that leave the possibility open. Another possibility is there is recordings by Sura in the early 20th century that identified a pafada or a turtle bone pit at this site. It hasn't been found since, but the clarity of his report is pretty trustworthy and definitely opens the door to things that we may find down the track. At HAP, this assemblage was mostly concentrated across several groups with entirely complete or near complete vertebrae. These were excavated in situ and some of them were originally articulated. It also had really mild weathering, implying the remains were quite recent and likely deposited after the site had become a bit disturbed. So although HAP01 can't be confirmed as a marae, there was no doubt intentionality behind the differential deposition of complete vertebrae, which was split between several preserved groups in what seems to be a single deposition event. So deposition at this site, as it's dated quite later, raises some interesting questions about post-contact use of marae that will be interesting to look at in the future as well. So a major success of this study relates to diversity and complexity in ritual practices. Even when we view them conservatively, the results show that rituals involving sea turtles can't be encompassed by existing descriptions or typologies that we have. For example, the deposition of turtles alongside other animal species reflects multi-species practices at marae, which we don't have any descriptions or accounts of so far in literature. And also it raises questions about specialized marae for turtles or marae tefai that are often described in ethnography. If these did exist on Fakahina, these findings show the importance of looking at the fauna there systematically to maybe illuminate what can now be seen as a wide variety of diverse ritual behaviours. So in terms of future directions, contextual taphonomy is also obviously really effective here. Polynesian contexts in particular can benefit from the rich ethnohistoric records that we have. And this is an approach that definitely gains strength through numbers and comparison as well. So the addition of more sites to look at things chronologically, regionally, and also maybe open the door to more parts of ritual that we're likely missing here, especially at the beginning and the ends, is an important future direction. And we can also take a more in-depth approach to the variation and complexity of behaviours. For example, there's potential differences in the morphology of cut marks between HAP and REV. So this down the line could tell us about butchery differences and tool use at ritual sites. There's also other sites, further studies of fauna recovered from excavations at Marae Te Tahato and Te Poto, for example, could also present cases where large quantities of turtle bone associated with oven features could clearly identify early behavioural sequences that we couldn't see at Fakahina. So I'd like to say thank you for my supervisors on this project, Gia Mol and Sophia Sambacaro at the ANU. Thank you also for CIRAP to funding this venture. And yes, any questions, please feel free to have a chat or send them to me by email. Thank you.